Every arc in One Piece has one. A character who walks in surrounded by fear, draped in a reputation so big that everyone around them just assumes they're untouchable. A genius, a god, a hero, the strongest man in the room. And then the Straw Hats show up, and within a few chapters, that reputation gets peeled back like wet paper, and underneath it, there's almost always the same thing. A coward, a liar, a bully who got lucky, someone who built an empire on a story instead of on actual strength. That's not an accident. Oda has been quietly making the same point since the very first chapter, and most people never notice the pattern until you line all of these characters up side by side. So today, that's exactly what we're doing. We're walking through the biggest frauds and fake geniuses in One Piece, arc by arc, and figuring out why the world believed them and what finally exposed them. And look, speaking of people who talk a big game and then don't deliver, if you've made it this far into the video and you still haven't subscribed, you are technically pulling an Alvida right now. Big presence, impressive reputation, suspiciously little follow-through. Don't be a fraud about this one. Hit that subscribe button so the algorithm stops treating me like a small-time East Blue pirate, and let's get into the list. We might as well start where the series itself starts. Alvida is the very first antagonist Luffy ever runs into, and she's built on the most fragile lie in the whole story. She runs a small pirate crew, and she forces every single member of that crew to agree that she is the most beautiful woman on the seas. Not because they believe it, but because the alternative is getting beaten with her iron mace. Her whole reputation is just fear wearing the costume of admiration. The moment Luffy shows up, very honestly does not care who she is or what she looks like. The whole illusion cracks. She swings at him, lands basically nothing, and gets knocked out almost immediately. First villain, first fraud, and Oda sets the tone right there. A reputation that only survives because nobody's allowed to question it is not a reputation. It's a hostage situation. Then we get to Shell's Town, and this is where it gets interesting, because the next fraud isn't even a pirate. He's a marine. Axe Hand. Morgan is a captain in the organization that's supposed to represent justice, and his whole career is built on a lie he didn't even tell himself. He got famous and got promoted for capturing a notorious pirate, except he didn't capture anyone. That whole event was staged by Captain Kuro, who used his abilities to fake the capture and let Morgan take the credit. So Morgan's authority, his rank, the fear he rules his town with, all of it traces back to a crime he had nothing to do with solving. And once he had power, he became a tyrant, executing his own people and demanding worship. But Luffy and Zoro tear through him without taking a real hit, and the lie collapses the second someone stronger refuses to play along. And here's the genuinely clever part. The pirate who set up that fake capture, Kuro, is the next fraud, and he might be the first real fake genius in the series. Kuro faked his own death and capture by the Marines to make the world government stop hunting him. Then he spent 3 full years living undercover in a quiet village as a mild-mannered butler named Klahadore, slowly worming his way into a rich young woman's household so he could eventually have her sign over her fortune and then have her killed. That's not luck, that's a long con. Kuro earns the word genius for real, but Oda still makes a point of it. Even the smartest schemer in the East Blue is undone by his own arrogance, because he assumes a kid in a straw hat couldn't possibly ruin a plan he spent years building. Out at the Barati, we get the loudest fraud yet. Don Krieg storms in bragging that he commands the largest pirate fleet in the East Blue, and calling himself the strongest man around. And here's the thing, he limps into that restaurant half-starved, gets fed out of basic kindness, and then immediately tries to seize the place from the people who just saved his life. His whole leadership style is threats. He keeps his crew in line by making them more afraid of him than of dying. But the reality of where he stands gets exposed almost instantly, because Mihawk, an actual top-tier swordsman just passing through the area, sinks Krieg's whole armada like it's a minor errand. The supposed strongest man in the East Blue isn't even the strongest man in that one specific scene, and then Luffy breaks through his armor and his arsenal of weapons and beats him anyway. Arlong Park gives us a fraud with an ideology attached, which makes him more dangerous. Arlong preaches that fishmen are simply superior to humans, and he wears his high bounty like proof that he's earned his place at the top. But scratch the surface, and his power isn't built on being better than anyone, it's built on cheating. He runs a protection racket on Nami's village and dangles a deal in front of her, 100 million berries to buy back her hometown's freedom. The catch is that he's secretly secretly working with a corrupt marine, Captain Nezumi, to steal that money the moment she gets close, so she can never actually win. The whole superiority act is a smokescreen for a rigged game, and when the rigging finally fails and Luffy comes for him, Arlong loses his composure so badly that he starts wrecking his own base. So much for the superior being. Nezumi himself deserves a quick mention because he's the fraud version of a marine. He takes Arlong's bribes to look the other way, raids the village to confiscate the savings, and even shoots civilians. Then, the second the Straw Hats win, he tries to swoop in and take credit for Arlong's defeat and pocket the treasure. He gets publicly humiliated and forced to give the money back. He's a tiny character, but he's a clean example of the rot Oda keeps pointing at. The badge doesn't make the man honest, which brings us to one of the most interesting names on this list, and one that technically isn't even a villain, Smoker. Here's the uncomfortable thing about Smoker. He's one of the most honorable marines in the whole story. His moral compass actually points true north, which is rare in this world, but his track record is a disaster, and that's the point. He nearly arrests Luffy in Logetown, and then a storm rips through the execution platform the moment Dragon arrives, and Luffy slips away before the capture is even finished. Years later in the New World, Smoker goes up against Trafalgar Law and gets his literal heart cut out of his chest. Then Doflamingo humiliates him so thoroughly that another Admiral-level fighter has to step in and save his life. Smoker is the fraud the series treats with sympathy, not because he's dishonest, but because he exposes a bigger lie, the myth that the Marines are simply unbeatable. Being right doesn't make you strong, and in this world, that gap gets people hurt. If you like this kind of breakdown, by the way, this is the part where I remind you the channel does this every week, so subscribing is the easy move. Anyway, once the crew hits the Grand Line, the frauds start coming faster. At Whiskey Peak, Igaram, working as the bounty hunter Mr. 8, plays the welcoming mayor of a town that throws a giant party for incoming pirates. Also, the bounty hunters can attack them once their guard is down. It's a decent trap, it just completely misjudges who walked into it. Zoro handles the ambush almost casually, and the moment the act falls apart, Igaram drops the menacing host routine and starts begging for protection. His authority was always theatre. Little Garden gives us Mr. 3, a man absolutely convinced he's a tactical mastermind. He rigs the centuries-long duel between two giants with a hidden bomb, traps the Straw Hats in wax, and plans to deliver them as polished statues to impress his boss. He spends the whole arc mocking other agents for failing. Then his masterpiece plan falls apart. Luffy frees everyone, and Mr. 3 does what frauds in this series always do when the plan breaks. He runs, and then he lies to his superior, reporting the mission as a success it absolutely was not. Drum Island hands us a different flavour of fraud. Wapol isn't pretending to be a genius, he's pretending to be a king. He's the ruler of a country who banned nearly every doctor in the kingdom, except his own handful of loyalists, deliberately keeping his people sick and dependent on him, so they'd never stop needing him. And then, the instant a real threat showed up at his borders, this king abandoned his whole country and fled, taking his doctors and soldiers with him, and leaving his people defenseless. A crown doesn't make you a king. Running the moment your people need you tells everyone exactly what you actually are. And then there's Alabasta, which might be the most elegant fraud in the first half of the series. What does it actually take to be celebrated as a national hero for years, while you're secretly destroying the country from the inside? Sir Crocodile is the answer. To the public, Crocodile is Alabasta's savior, the warlord who defeats pirates and protects the kingdom. In reality, he's the source of the kingdom's suffering. He engineers droughts, manufactures unrest, and frames the king for the chaos he himself created, all to push the country into a civil war he can exploit, so he can seize the throne and get his hands on an ancient weapon. He mocks the ordinary people suffering through his manufactured drought, and even after Luffy beats him and the truth comes out and his warlord title gets stripped, Crocodile is still spinning it, acting like staying in prison was somehow his own choice. The hero of Alabasta was the villain of Alabasta the entire time. Over in Jaya, we meet Bellamy, and he's a fraud of a more modern kind. He's the guy who's decided that dreams are dead, that the age of believing in legends and chasing the impossible is over, and that real pirates just prey on the weak. He builds a whole identity around mocking anyone who still dares to dream. The problem is that his entire philosophy depends on him only ever picking fights he's already sure he can win. He looks at Luffy, misreads everything about him, and assumes he's an easy target, not realizing this is someone who just took down a warlord. One punch, that's all it takes. Bellamy's whole worldview gets knocked flat in a single hit. And what makes him interesting is that much later in the story, when his luck has run out, he finally chooses to stand with Luffy instead of mocking him, even when it costs him dearly. Oda lets the fraud grow up a little. Skypiea gives us the purest fake god in the series. What happens when someone who believes he's untouchable finally meets the one thing his power can't reach? Enel is the answer to that question. Enel literally declares himself a god. He has immense lightning powers and an ability that lets him hear everything happening across the island, so to the people below him, he seems all-knowing and all-powerful. He destroyed his own homeland and fully convinced himself that he was a divine being who couldn't be harmed. And then he runs into Luffy, whose rubber body makes him completely immune to electricity. The single most important weapon in this god's arsenal does nothing, and the look on Enel's face the moment he realizes his lightning is useless is the whole theme of this video in one panel. The invincible god was only ever invincible because he'd never met the wrong opponent. Long ring. Long land is lighter, but the pattern's still there. Foxy built a reputation on a long winning streak in his rigged little competitions, the Davy backfights, where he steals crew members from other pirates. But that streak was never about strength. It was about tricks, cheating, and games designed so he'd always come out ahead. The moment he runs into someone who simply refuses to lose, the streak ends and the legend deflates. Then comes Water 7 and Eni's lobby, and honestly this is where the fraud theme gets the most layered, because it isn't just one person. How does one of the deadliest covert units in the world government end up answering to the weakest man in the room? That's the question Eni's lobby quietly asks. CP9 is a whole assassination squad built on deception. Kaku spent years living in Water 7 as a respected shipwright, well-liked and well-trusted, while secretly hunting for the blueprints to an ancient weapon the whole time. Khalifa did the same thing as a trusted secretary, gaining the confidence of one of the most important men in the city while quietly spying for the government. Their kindness, their competence, their entire public lives, all of it was cover. But the real fraud at the top of CP9 is Spandam, and he's the one Oda clearly enjoys mocking the most. Spandam is the director of this elite unit, and he is physically one of the weakest fighters in it. He can't use any of the special combat techniques his agents are famous for. His position comes from connections and nerve, not ability, and he survives almost entirely by hiding behind subordinates who can actually fight. And the cherry on top, in the middle of trying to look powerful and intimidating, Spandam accidentally triggers a buster call, summoning a massive marine assault that endangers everyone on the island, including his own side. The man in charge of the world government's deadliest secret weapons is a coward who can barely throw a punch and nearly gets himself killed by showing off. That's not subtle. That's Oda telling you exactly what he thinks of people who rule through borrowed power. Thriller Bark gives us Gecko Moria, a former warlord who wants to become Pirate King without doing any of the work. His entire strategy is built around making other people fight for him. He steals shadows, builds an army of zombies, and openly admits that his whole philosophy is relying on others to achieve his own goals. His catchphrase is basically just ordering other people to do it. He's convinced he can't lose because he never personally enters the fight, and then the Straw Hats dismantle his zombie army and beat him anyway, which exposes the obvious flaw in trying to become the strongest pirate in the world while refusing to actually be strong yourself. Back at Sabaody, we get two frauds for the price of one. First there's Duval, whose whole fearsome gang leader persona exists for one absurd reason. His face happens to look exactly like Sanji's terrible wanted poster, so people kept mistaking him for a criminal, and he built a whole masked, vengeful identity around hiding it. The moment the mask comes off, his reason for being a villain just evaporates, and he ends up an ally. And then there's Demolo Black, the man who decided the easiest way to be famous was to just put on a straw hat and a fake scar and pretend to be Luffy. He recruited a whole fake crew off the back of the real one's reputation and committed crimes under a borrowed name. It works right up until the actual Straw Hats walk into the same place, at which point the imposter hides behind his own fake crew and folds instantly. Stolen reputation has a very short shelf life when the real thing shows up. Fishman Island gives us Hody Jones, and he's a particularly nasty kind of fraud proud because he wraps himself in a righteous cause. He preaches fishman supremacy and vengeance against humans as though he's a warrior fighting for his people. But his strength is fake in the most literal sense. It comes from energy steroids, drugs that boost his power while shortening his life, and he gobbles them by the handful. He even threatens his own crew when they try to get him to stop. He's willing to sacrifice enormous numbers of his own people for his cause, and he built his whole movement on a lie about who killed their beloved queen. Take away the drugs and the lies, and there's nothing underneath. Even after he loses, he refuses to admit he was ever wrong, which is the most fraud thing a fraud can do. And then Punk Hazard gives us maybe the most on-the-nose fake genius in the series. Caesar Clown calls himself a brilliant scientist, and sure, on paper, the man can build weapons of mass destruction. But look at how he actually operates. He kidnaps children and uses them as test subjects, then keeps them compliant by getting them addicted to a drug, while telling them it's medicine that's making them big and strong. He lies to their faces about the disaster that scarred his island, pinning the blame on a rival to cover his own role. His genius is just cruelty with a lab coat on. And the instant he's actually cornered and his life is on the line, the brilliant, untouchable mad scientist immediately starts begging for mercy. Real power doesn't plead, frauds do. So step back and look at all of them lined up. Alvida and her forced compliments, Morgan and his stolen capture, Krieg and his empty boasting, Arlong and his rigged game, Crocodile and his hero costume, Enel and his godhood, Spandam and his borrowed authority, Caesar and his lab coat full of lies, different arcs, different powers, different scales, completely different stories, but it's the same skeleton underneath every single one, a reputation built on fear, deception, or sheer luck, inflated until the world simply accepts it as truth, and then punctured the moment it meets someone who refuses to be impressed. And that's the part that makes this more than a fun list, because Oda isn't just writing villains, he's making an argument, and he's been making it consistently for the entire series. In this world, status doesn't equal strength, a title doesn't equal worth, a scary reputation tells you what people are afraid of, not what's actually true. The characters who endure in One Piece, the ones who genuinely earn their place, almost never get there by demanding to be feared. They get there through resilience, through humility, through actually showing up for the people around them when it counts. The frauds build monuments to themselves. The real ones build crews. There's a strange irony hiding in all of this too. The series also has a character who accidentally became one of the most feared men alive, almost entirely on reputation and luck, and Oda lets that one keep winning. But that's a story for another video, and if you want it, you already know what to do. For now, the lesson the Grand Line keeps repeating is simple. Anyone can wear the costume. Anyone can demand the title. Anyone can build a legend out of fear and borrowed power. Anyone can F. But sooner or later, somebody walks in who just doesn't care about the story, and that's the moment you find out. As always, thank you for watching and have a nice one.